Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here and today we paint a Black Templar. The How to Paint Space Marine series is moving slowly, but is definitely moving, especially behind the curtains. And to celebrate its return, it's time to paint a warrior from the top 3 of the most requested chapters, the zealous Black Templars. I was really undecided between a video about how to paint black in a more general sense or to use a specific subject, but fate took the decision out of my hands when I found the perfect model. Don't worry, I keep the study of black for another occasion, and in the meantime you can use this video as a base to understand my point of view and general workflow when it comes to paint a tricky color like black. Trust me, there's more than enough here to start doing some interesting experiments. The plan is still to paint every single heraldry of the main Loyalist and Traitor chapters, but the idea evolved a bit, and I decided to push a bit more not only on the color schemes but also on the sculpts of the models. The series started with a simple conversion and a limited edition model, but I wanted something more, something bigger, not only for the wow effect, but also to show and explain better every step and technique. Okay, and because I want super cool stuff for my collection. So, here is the general reviewed concept, a little preview of this long-term project, and what will probably come next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel.
The first idea was to use 30k primarks from ForgeWorld to convert simple but oversized Space Marines, showing with an overload of details the true aesthetic of their chapters. I started with this Ultramarine based on Gilliman, simply changing the head, the right hand and few details here and there. The base is super simple to save a bit of the height of the model and still be able to use it in a skirmish game. Yeah, I want to play with these models. Then I discovered 3D printing, and this opened so many options for conversions and new models that I had to reboot the project and my brain fused by the shock. I maintained the scale of ForgeWorld Primarks, roughly 50-55mm, resizing these models from their huge original size to these more wargaming friendly volumes. They were meant to be big collectible figures, and making them in this scale still quite large required a lot of study and work. And still, I made some mistakes that I've hidden under bits and extra details. The model I'll use today is a creation of 3D Art Guy, and it was meant to be the central figure of a large diorama. This sculpt is packed with details, and they handle very well the resizing process thanks to their depth and sharp edges. You can check all his incredible models following the links to his Patreon and my mini factory pages in the description. It's finally time to slap some colors on the model. As always, I start with a coat of black. You know that I love Molotov One for All Black as first layer and as main base for my dark values, because of its satin, almost glossy finish, and the depth it creates, but the only job it has to do this time is to be my primer. The shocking truth of my way of painting black is that I don't use black paint. As usual, in the next stage, I use white ink to create the general value sketch of the volumes. The idea is to paint the armor like an unpolished, almost satin metallic surface. Reflective, but not too reflective, like the ones we are used to see in the artworks and illustrations. I'm not looking for the metallic reflections in this stage, but I want to set a precise direction of the main light, justifying the simple ideal shapes of the various parts of the model, like the sphere of the head, the large cylinder of the torso, and the smaller cylinders of arms and legs. I keep the contrast between lights and shadows a bit lower than the one I want in the final product, because I'll add several layers on top of this initial sketch, and especially in the shadows, I want to maintain some virtual space before reaching the extreme value of black. This is extremely important while working with dark tones, not only black, that have to keep and show their being dark, still delivering the information of a value modulation between recesses and highest points. Yeah, I haven't got the wrong name. This model will become a Black Templar, not a White Scar. You can start adding highlights directly over the black primer, but I find that brushing or spraying colors that have a big gap of value and brightness between them is always a pain. Even using a good scale of progressive tones and well-thin paints, the difference between pure black and any color in the light gray and white spectrum produces unwanted effects like a fine dust or a dry texture, for example, or tones that don't reach their maximum saturation and vibrancy because they fail to cover well the previous layer. You can overcome this issue with an extremely good control over values, dilutions and tones, but with this approach everything becomes super easy to control because you are splitting the big painting problem solving in smaller, more manageable little problems. Value first, without any other distraction. Then the colors, focusing only on tones and interesting contrasts.
Black is a complex entity that, in the real world, is never real ideal black. This is true for every color, but black and white are even more affected by environmental light and the finish and physical structure of the materials. I'm dressed in full black, surrounded by black objects, and every single one of them has different tones and shades.
The real secret here is to consider black as any other color, and the trick to make it work as any other color lies deep in the color wheel. As always, the most important tool to have in your toolbox is a solid knowledge of the basic rules of color theory. And subtractive color mixing, that's the one we consider when using physical paints and pigments. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check the video up here to better understand the logic of the next steps. To simplify this huge topic and to focus only on what we need for this specific project, let's say that when you mix together the three primaries of the CMY system, cyan, magenta and yellow, you obtain black, because of their properties of light absorption all mixed together. The extension of this concept is that when you mix complementary tones like blue and orange or red and green, that contains all the primaries in various proportions, you create a shade of grey. And if you choose dark, saturated versions of these tones, you can arrive pretty close to black. Here I'm using inks just because they are functional to the next stages of this paint job, but this theory works with any kind of paint. The huge game changer is that the black you obtain from these mixes is much more vibrant, interesting and full of subtle tones and differences that simple black paint doesn't have because it's meant to be only simple, boring black. That's why these are called chromatic black. When you see these mixes next to black, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between them, but when you start spreading the paint, you can immediately notice the tones hidden inside every mix. The beauty of this is that you can unbalance the mix, changing the proportions of their components, creating a colder or warmer black, something more greenish or bluish or with more red sensations inside. And when you bring these colors on the model, this makes a world of difference. That's the reason why I use magenta instead of red, because I wanted a less balanced mix able to express a bit more its warm tones. The visual effect is subtle, but you are suddenly able to create a realistic black that is closer to our everyday experience of this tone, compared to the perfect pure black from a pot. Plus, the little variations of colors makes you able to create interesting inner contrast between the various tones. I want to set the model in a cold light with warm shadows and bouncing tones coming from a rusty base. So I use the warmer mix to tint the shadows and I add a couple of extra drops of magenta to make it even warmer. I spray from below and I insist more in the shadows I set with the value sketch. Then I move to the bluish chromatic black to paint all the rest. Painting in transparency over the light sketch gives me a lot of control and a lot of forgiving space to modulate the tones and their values. 2 steps are all you need to create a beautiful and vibrant black. Sadly, the model seems a bit grey under the powerful cold lights of my table and through the eye of the camera, but in person the tones are darker and deeper and obviously full of interesting nuances and internal contrast. I lost a bit the intensity of the initial sketch, but this is part of the game, and it will be easy to bring back the contrast in the later stages. Still, all the lights and shadows you see on the model are the ones set in the first stage. But before these steps, I need to see the black next to a couple of the other main tones to better judge the situation outside this general grayscale. I quickly set a base tone for the rest of the base using contrast Gryphoned Orange. I masked a couple of spots that will be painted in white to protect the black armor. You know that I'm not afraid by a bit of overspray, but that's because usually the parts close to each other share the majority of the tones of environmental lights and shadows that I apply with the airbrush, making the overspray not only not a problem, but even a useful thing. In this case, the jump of tones and values is the most extreme, and I need to protect the work already done. I spray also just a bit of burnt umber on the white fabric to tone down and shade the flat white, making it more like an old monastic robe. Now I feel ready to adjust the contrast on the armor using white ink, mixed with my previous cold chromatic black and a lot of Airbrush Thinner to increase the transparency. This is not a main or mandatory step, but just a way to adjust and perfect the previous work that isn't exactly like I wanted. I close the progression with white ink and Airbrush Thinner to create this kind of extreme transparency. You have to be really careful spraying or painting white over a dark surface, and the key is to work with a subtle transparency layer by layer. This way the overspray will blend with the surface without creating dust and dots, or unwanted chalky marks with the brush. And you can always go back to the chromatic black to increase the shadows. Or to create a more subtle transition with the light, bringing out even more of their hidden tones. I reduced a bit the contrast with the light using the cold black to push on the sensation of a satin, less reflective metal that conveys more tones and less striking reflections. This is very important on the sword, that is the highest point of the model, more exposed to the virtual light of the scene and its cold tone. This way I enhance the nice transition from white to black, moving through cold blue and warm magenta nuances. This is a lot of complexity and visual interest for a couple of steps. The general work on the armor is almost done, and being Space Marine's 99% armor, the main part of the work is already done. I mix a dark cold silver using scale 75 trash metal, turquoise and black inks. Thanks to its components, this mix will be highly saturated, shiny, super fluid, and with an eye covering power. And a cold greenish old gold using the same silver, burnt umber and sap green. Same properties of the first mix and same cold tone, because I want these metals to reflect the cold environmental light. And silver and sap green ink to paint the laurel crown on the helmet. I like to consider it like a metal decoration of the helmet more than proper laurel. I add contrast and depth to all the metal parts with a wash of magenta, darkened with violet, plus Airbrush Thinner to make it more transparent, and Glaze Medium to add consistency. This is the transparency I'm looking for. This will add a simple warm shadow to all the metals that will complement with their original cold tone. And it will make a nice powerful contrast when I come back with the original cold tones, adding the highlights. At this point, I move to the wet palette and the full range of Kimera Kolors. Let's take a moment to thank my best patrons. Our number is growing every single day, and now more than ever I can do all this work on the videos because of your incredible support. Thanks a million, guys! In this stage, I simply want to add base tones and a couple of lights and shadows to all the little elements that didn't get attention until now, like grenades, leather bags, the red elements of the heraldry, and some tones for the trophy Traitor's Head. With all these tones in place, but before the serious brush work on armor and fabric, I take a quick detour on oil paints. I put on the palette only black and burnt umber because in this project I need to do only a couple of quick steps with oils. First, I use black for an easy, stress-free panel lining. Creating the dark definition of every single panel of an armor like this is a huge amount of delicate work using acrylics, but a matter of minutes using oils. For all the details about this technique, I can finally suggest you to follow this link up here for an exhaustive explanation. The application is so precise that I need only the brush with a bit of white spirit to refine some of the lines and fix here and there the few mistakes I made. And now that you know all the basics of the use of oil paints, I can bring back one of my favorite techniques to paint weathered old fabric. Apply a thick layer of dense oil wash, and BAM! Everything is done in a single step. Obviously you can refine the process with smaller sponges, Q-tips and brushes, but I will never lose a chance to say BAM! Time to come back to the wet palette to paint edge and extreme highlights and battle damages on the armor. And since for some reason the camera didn't record while I was creating the palette, I'll do it again here below. I use white, blue and black to create a desaturated light blue as my master recipe. From this pool I create warmer shades and lighter tones to use in different parts of the armor. The key for a good edge highlight is to understand that even if you are painting the extreme points of light of a model, they still have their relative lights and shadows depending on their position. An edge in the feet doesn't catch the same light of an edge on the helmet. This part is long but for sure not tedious, because if you paint it in the correct way, it's a constant flow of decision and problem solving. Plus, after every brushstroke the model gains a whole new level of definition and contrast, and this is extremely satisfying. Modulating this effect, you can create a super realistic shine using no more than 3 or 4 shades. I'm putting a strong accent on the edge highlights not because I'm painting black, but because I'm painting a non-metallic effect, and the final quality of this kind of illusion is extremely dependent on this stage. I don't want to give the idea that edge highlighting is a core part of painting black, like in the heavy metal style. It's always an important part of every paint job and an essential step for non-metallic effects, but it's not the foundation for an interesting black. While painting edges and fine lines, the consistency of paint is a matter of personal taste. Thicker paint is easier to control, but I prefer a fluid consistency, so if I catch a line with the right angle, I can continue the movement as long as I can. I add a bit of glaze medium to get this fluid but consistent behavior. That helps also with the fine texture of the 3D print that fights a bit against the brush. With this consistency, it's easy to catch even the most difficult inner lines and edges. After a couple of hours of work on the armor, the fabric is ready to get textures and highlights with acrylics. White Spirit is completely dry and the quantity of paint left on the model is minimal, so everything is dry to the touch and there's absolutely no problem to go back to acrylics. I use quick, short brushstrokes to simulate the thick structure of a rough cloth, and I increase the value little by little for a better general definition and more contrast between the folds. At the last moment, I decided to add a red flaming glow in the accessory of the belt and the eyes. There was something missing in those focal points, and the red glow is perfect for a raging Black Templar. I was so focused on the armor that I totally missed these important details. It's easy to lose sight of the general picture when you start going into smaller and smaller details. I close the work in the extreme lights using Winsor & Newton titanium white. This white is extremely light and brilliant, but I use it more because of its heavy body consistency. I want to use it to add extreme little dots of light, and a little drop of dense paint has a larger physical surface able to reflect more light than a flat brushstroke. This creates the illusion of a brighter spot of light, even if the white used is the same. In the last step, I use Molotov Lobster with a lot of Airbrush Thinner to add a fine matte dust around the feet. This is just a little subtle step, but will help to add more realism, creating a connection with the base instead of having the model disconnected and floating over the rusty floor. And here is the final result. I went quite deep into the various aspects of this paint job, making it look like something more complex than what it really is. Okay, there's a lot of theory and reasoning behind every step to bring them to a higher level of efficiency and effectiveness, but when you understand how and why certain things work, everything becomes extremely easy. And this is true especially for all the discussion about black. The general idea is to work from general to particular. Volumes, lights and shapes with the value sketch, then the main tones, wrapping in color all the volumes. All the next steps are a consequence of this foundation and a way to refine what you already have in place. With this kind of roadmap, you can never lose your way in the middle of a paint job, and you can push forward as long as you have fun.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!